Okay, so the player class. The main purpose of the player class is for each player to keep track of his own score for each category and to display those scores in the appropriate column on the scorecard. Now, player implements mouse listener because it's going to listen to every click, and then when it is an appropriate time, if it's the time for that player to score some dice, it'll check to see if that click is in an appropriate category, and if it is, it'll then adjust the score for that category. So the variables that each player needs, it needs to know an index. It needs to know, and that it'll use that to determine which column to place the score in, and also it'll check and make sure that the clicks are in the appropriate column, otherwise it will ignore them. It needs something to store, some way of storing the score for each category in the upper section. There are 6 categories: 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, and 6s. So because each one of those corresponds with a number, it's convenient to store those scores in an array of ints that we just call upper section, where the index, if the index is 1, it'll be the score for the 1s category. If the index is 2, it'll be the 2s category, and so on, all the way up to 6. Now notice that indexes for arrays always start at 0, and we don't have a zeros category. That's okay, we'll just leave that, the value in that index, just unused. Now because it's an int, it's a basic data type, it'll set it to 0 by default. We'll just set it to -1 and ignore that one location in the array. In the lower section, we've got 3 of a kind, 4 of a kind, full house, small straight, large straight, Yahtzee, and chance. Those are the different categories. And each one of those is rather unique, so it didn't seem to make much sense to try to store those in an array. So I've decided to store each one of those as a separate variable. And so the player has an index, and then it's going to score some dice. And so we'll store those 5 dice in an array we call all dice. And we're going to do that variable a little bit different than what we typically do, because sometimes the player will have dice to score and sometimes it will not. It'll start out without any dice to score. And so we'll start all dice out at null. Null meaning nothing. It's just an address to nothing. And then we'll check to see if it's nothing when they click, and if it is, we just won't do anything. But if it's got dice to score when they click, then we'll go ahead and try to score them. The constructor for the player takes an int, and it assigns that int to the index. So when we create a player, we tell the player what its index is. We can see that in the game class, where we go through a loop and we create our players, we call the constructor, and we pass it an int. So I starts out at 0, it goes up as long as it's less than 6. So we'll create players with index 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And so each one of those players is going to have its own unique index. Starts out without any dice. We create an array able to hold 7 ints, and we store that array in the upper section variable. And then we fill up that array, so we go index 0, less than 7, right? Because it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. That's 7 indices because we've got 1 through 6 and 0. We store a -1 in every spot in the upper section. And the way I wrote my code, I'm going to consider a -1 in a category as being empty. And so as I write my code, I'll check to see if that category currently has a -1. If it does, then we'll go ahead and score it. If it does not, then I'll consider it to be already scored, and then I'll do something different. So we'll just initialize these to -1. And we'll initialize all the other categories: 3 of a kind, 4 of a kind, full house, small straight, large straight, Yahtzee, and chance. We initialize every category to -1, meaning that every category is blank. Now, we need some way to know if the scorecard is full. Okay, that means that every category is scored, and when every category has been scored for every player, the scorecard is full. So we've gone ahead and written that method, and it's rather easy to see if there is any section, indexes 1 through 6 in the upper section, that is equal to -1, then that category is empty and not yet scored. If there's an empty category, then hey, the scorecard is not full. So it's just going through that array, that upper section array, looking for a -1. If it finds one, it goes ahead and returns false. As soon as we return false from a method, the method is done, it's finished. So if we find an empty section, we return false, meaning the scorecard is not full. And if we get through that loop and we have not returned, then we're going to check each of the other categories. If 3 of a kind is equal to -1, return false. If 4 of a kind is equal to -1, return false. If full house, return false. Small straight, large straight, Yahtzee, and chance. If any of those is equal to a -1, it'll return false. Now, if it's gotten through all of those and it still has not returned false, then it can return true, meaning it has checked every category. All of them, none of them are empty. If none of the categories are empty, then the scorecard is full, return true. Okay? I'm going to just go through each one of these methods and describe in general what they do without getting into all the detail of the rest of them, and then I'll go back in a later video and describe the details. So paint is the method that actually just draws the text, and you can see there's a good bit of logic here. It'll take a little bit of time to go through. So we've got the paint method. We've got a place dice method. And this is really fairly simple. This place dice method is public. It'll be called by the game. The game is going to give the player a set of dice, and then the player stores those dice, that set of dice, in the all dice variable. Remember that all dice variable started out as null. Okay, it starts out as null. And so when the game calls the place dice method, it's essentially passing a bunch of dice to the player, and the player is going to hang on to those. Once it's got something stored in the all dice method, it's going to know, hey, I'm listening for mouse clicks. And so that when it hears the mouse click, it's going to check and see this all dice variable. And if it's equal to null, then it won't do anything. It'll say, hey, I don't have any dice to score. But if it's not equal to null, then it's going to check and see where the click is and try to score those dice appropriately. Get upper total. This is a method that you're going to write. I've got it written here, but I've got it folded up so that you cannot see it. The idea here with get upper total is that it's just going to return the sum of all the ints in the upper section, being careful to skip anything that's set to -1. And get lower total is going to be similar. It's just going to add up all of the variables that are in the lower section, all the categories, the scores, being careful to skip anything that is set to a -1. Mouse release, mouse clicked, mouse entered, and mouse exited. Those are methods that had to be written because we implement the mouse listener interface. But we only have stubs for those 4 methods because we're really not interested in capturing those events. When the mouse is released, when the mouse is clicked, when the mouse enters the window, or when the mouse exits the window, we don't really have any code that needs to be executed at those times. But we also, as a part of that interface, have to write a mouse pressed. And that's really the event that we're interested in capturing. we have to implement the mouse listener interface if we're going to register the player as a mouse listener in the game. Remember, the JFrame inherits the add mouse listener method, and it can add any object that implements the mouse listener interface. As soon as it has added that object as a mouse listener, then that object is listening for mouse events. And as soon as one occurs, as soon as the mouse is released, the mouse released method of that object gets called. This is just a stub. It doesn't do anything when the mouse is released. A mouse clicked, mouse entered, mouse exited. But mouse presses we want to listen to. And this is, if the mouse is pressed and all dice is equal to null, return. Otherwise, we're going to do some interesting stuff. And I'll go through the details of exactly what happens when a mouse is pressed in a later video. But just understand that once the player is created, if he's implemented the mouse listener interface, he's able to listen to mouse clicks. And he has been registered as a mouse listener in the JFrame. So now he's listening, every player is registered as listening to every mouse event. So every player is going to catch every mouse press. There's a total all dice method, which you're going to write. Is basically, you've got an array, all dice. Each die has a get value method, and you are going to get the value of each die, add them up, and return the total. So that's total all dice. Get die count. Now this is a more complicated method. This video is getting kind of long. I'm going to explain that in a lot more detail in a later video. Basically, the idea here is that there are multiple ways to store information. And as a computer programmer, is always got to do something on data, some sort of calculation. And when you do the calculations, if you store the information in one way, it might be easy to do the calculation. If you store it in a different way, it'll be easy to do a different sort of calculation. Right now, we're storing each die separately, and each die knows that its value. And this get die counts is going to convert that same information into a different format, where it's got an array, and it's the count of how many dice we have of each value. You'll see it in a little more detail later. End turn. So this method is called whenever the player is going to end its turn. So if it's the player's turn, he has some dice to score. Once he's done scoring them, he has to set that back to null again so that he'll stop listening for clicks. He's got to tell the game that the dice have been placed, and then the game is going to do some bookkeeping. And he's also got to tell the game to go ahead and repaint itself to display the stuff on the screen. So this is going to be called whenever the player's turn is over. Place 3 of a kind. So if the user has clicked in the 3 of a kind category, this is going to do all the work necessary of scoring the dice for a 3 of a kind. Place 4 of a kind is very, very, very similar to place 3 of a kind, except that, well, it's for 4 of a kind instead of 3 of a kind. So I'll go through this code and explain exactly how it works to you, and then you're going to, well, copy, paste, and modify to make it work for 4 of a kind. Place in full house is going to be executed if the person clicked in the full house category. And so you've got, for a full house, you've got a 2 of a kind and a 3 of a kind. And so I'll explain this code in a later video. Place in small straight. This is if they clicked in the small straight category. And this is going to adjust the score appropriately if they clicked in that category. It checks to see if they really have a small straight and adjusts the score. Place in large straight This is almost identical to place in small straight. So when I'll explain this code, you're going to copy, paste, and modify to make it work for place in large straight. Place in Yahtzee, this is if they clicked the Yahtzee category. I'll explain it. Place in chant. So this is not exactly like any of these other methods, but it's similar, except that it's a lot simpler than any of the others, because there's really not any special thing that you've got to calculate in the place in chance. So you'll write that one as well. Basically, if they click in that category, you've only got to check and see if that category is empty. If it is, then just adjust the score equal to the sum of all the dice, and hey, we've got a method that totals all the dice. So you can just call that method and adjust the value. But if it's full, then you have to ignore the click, which is something that is done in these other methods. So you'll have to think a little bit for this one, but it should be simpler than any of these others that I'm describing. And place in upper section. So this is one method that handles any category in the upper section. And because it's all stored in an array and all those categories are kind of similar, we were able to do it all in one method instead of having to write separate methods for each category in the upper section. So in the next video, I'll go through some of those methods in more detail. And so that'll be part 2. This is the end of part 1 for the player class.